Some places do not welcome a man right away, they wait in the silence, in the light on the water, in the way the wind brushes an old porch and makes a tired heart remember it is still allowed to hope. By the time Caleb Mason reached the edge of Northwood Lake, the afternoon had already begun to soften into that pale, hunting hour that makes even a worn road look almost sacred. His old pickup rolled slowly over the gravel, tires whispering against the ground, while the world ahead of him opened in layers of pine, silver water, and sky washed clean by the cold. At 40, Caleb carried himself with the quiet restraint of a man who had learned to conserve his strength for the moments that mattered. His broad shoulders rested under a faded tan work jacket, his dark blue jeans were worn at the knees, and the plain flannel shirt beneath his coat had the soft, faded look of something lived in through many long seasons. His face was angular and weathered, with a square jaw, a little stubble along the chin, and eyes the color of winter clouds over a lake, steady, observant, and deeper than they first appeared. Beside him sat Milo, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat and a silver sheen across the chest and muzzle, upright ears, an intelligent gaze, and the kind of calm alertness that made people lower their voices without knowing why. Milo had the stillness of a dog who understood more than he let on, and the small rhythmic tap of his tail against the passenger seat seemed to keep time with Caleb's breathing. They had been on the road for hours, leaving behind the noise of town and the heavy weight of a meeting that still sat in Caleb's chest like a stone. The lawyer's office had been too bright, too polished, too full of words that sounded final. Caleb had heard what was said, nodded when it was appropriate, and walked out with a folded envelope and the strange, hollow feeling that his own name had become something he was only allowed to carry in silence. The note inside the envelope had been brief and old-fashioned, almost careful in its handwriting, and it had pointed him toward this lake, toward a cabin that had been forgotten long enough for even the locals to stop mentioning it except in half-spoken stories. As the truck turned onto a narrower road, the pines grew taller and closer, and the lake began to appear between the trunks like a sheet of polished glass lying under the cold light. Caleb slowed without thinking. Something about the place reached him before he even saw the cabin, a quiet pressure in the air, a sense of waiting, as if the shoreline itself had been holding its breath for years. Milo lifted his head, nose working gently near the cracked window, then gave a low, thoughtful huff that made Caleb glance over and almost smile. "You feel it too, huh, boy?" he murmured, his voice low and worn in the easy way of a veteran speaking to the one companion who never asked him to explain anything. The road dipped, then curved, and there it was at last, tucked into a bend of the lake where the land rose in a gentle slope behind it, a small cabin of weathered wood, its roof lined with old pine needles, its porch tilted by time, and its windows catching the light in dull, amber reflections. It did not look grand. It did not look important. It looked like something the world had nearly forgotten, and yet it stood there with a dignity that no neglect could fully erase. Caleb brought the truck to a stop and let the engine fade into the hush. For a moment he simply sat with both hands on the wheel, staring through the windshield at the cabin, at the still water beyond it, at the long pale ribbon of light stretched across the lake. In that quiet, he could hear the soft click of Milo's collar, the rustle of leaves moving overhead, and the distant sound of water tapping against the shore with patient, endless rhythm. Then Caleb exhaled, opened the door, and stepped out into the cool air, where the smell of cedar, lake water, and old wood met him all at once like the beginning of a story he had not yet learned how to trust. Milo jumped down beside him and stood at his leg, looking forward with the solemn focus of a guardian who knew that some doors were not meant to be rushed. Caleb looked toward the cabin again, the folded paper still in his jacket pocket, and felt something he had not expected to feel that day, not relief, not certainty, but the faintest promise that this forgotten place might hold the one thing he had been missing for far longer than he cared to admit. Caleb stood for a moment beside the truck, one hand resting on the open door, the other in the pocket of his jacket where the folded note had already begun to soften at the creases from being touched so many times. The air by the lake was colder than it had felt from inside the cab, but it was a clean kind of cold, carrying the scent of cedar bark, damp earth, and water that had been moving quietly under the afternoon light long before he arrived. Milo remained close, his paws planted firmly on the gravel as he studied the cabin with the kind of still attention that made Caleb trust him more than instinct itself. The dog did not bark. He did not whine. He simply watched, ears forward, tail lowered, as if the cabin had already spoken to him in a language Caleb had only just begun to hear. Caleb took a slow breath, closed the truck door, and started down the short path toward the porch. Each step on the old gravel sounded louder than it should have, as though the world had gone quiet to make room for this moment. The cabin drew closer with every step, and with it came the small details that do not show themselves from the road: the faded green trim around the windows, the weathered porch rail worn smooth by years of hands that were no longer here, the small brass hinge on the front gate that had turned dull with age, and the little stack of split firewood that someone had sheltered under a sheet of tin near the side wall. It was the sort of place that carried evidence of a life once lived with care, then left in the custody of weather and time. Caleb paused at the first step and looked across the lake. Sunlight was sliding lower now, turning the water into a long, bright path of gold and pale silver. Far across the shoreline, the pines stood in deep rows, dark and still, while the cabin itself seemed to gather all that light and hold it without complaint. He climbed the porch slowly. The boards gave a soft, tired creak beneath his boots, not broken, not failing, simply speaking the way old wood speaks when it remembers being useful. Milo followed without hesitation and sat near the top step, looking toward the door with an alertness that seemed almost respectful. Caleb reached for the handle. It was cold beneath his fingers, rough in places where the finish had worn away, and when he turned it the latch resisted only slightly before yielding with a soft metallic click. The door opened inward on hinges that sighed from disuse, and a breath of stale cedar, dust, and long unopened air drifted out to greet him. The interior was dim at first, lit only by the angled light slipping through the side window, but even in that first glance Caleb could see that the cabin had not been stripped of its soul. A small table stood near the far wall, its surface marked by rings from old cups and the faint outline of a lamp that had once lived there every evening. A wool blanket still lay folded over the arm of a chair by the fireplace. The stone hearth was untouched except for a line of dust across the mantel and a few old ash marks that had settled into the grooves of the mortar. There were framed photographs on a narrow shelf, their glass clouded, their edges softened by time, and one of them caught Caleb by surprise because it showed the lake in summer, bright and green, with a child standing at the shore holding a fishing pole and laughing towards someone just outside the frame. Caleb did not move for several seconds. He simply looked, absorbing the quiet weight of the room. There was something deeply human about the cabin, something that did not feel abandoned so much as paused, as though the last people here had only stepped out for a moment and never made it back. Milo trotted in, nails tapping softly against the worn floorboards, then slowed near the hearth and lowered his nose toward the wood as if he had caught the trace of another life layered beneath the present one. Caleb watched the dog and then the room again, and the memory of the lawyer's office came back to him in fragments: the polished table, the carefully chosen words, the envelope slid across to him as if it weighed more than paper should. He had not understood then why he was being sent here, only that the letter came from someone whose name had once belonged to the center of his life and now sat at the far edge of it like a lamp waiting for someone to light it again. He crossed to the small table near the window and set the folded note down beside the dust. The paper looked almost fragile against the wood, yet it had brought him here, across miles of road and years of feeling set aside. Outside, the lake moved in tiny flashes under the lowering sun, and the room filled slowly with a warmer glow as the daylight shifted. Caleb ran his hand along the back of the chair and felt the rough grain beneath his fingertips, the kind of texture that reminds a person that time leaves marks on everything, but not all marks are signs of loss. Some are proof that something lasted. Milo had moved to the window and was standing still there, looking out over the water as if he were guarding the horizon. Caleb followed his gaze and then let his eyes settle on the cabin one detail at a time, noticing the small things that had not been visible from the porch: a hand-carved hook near the door, a tin cup on the shelf, a crack in the window glass that had been sealed years ago with clear resin, and the faint indentation of boots by the fireplace where someone had stood often enough to shape the floor. A quiet feeling began to rise in him then, cautious and unfamiliar, like the first warmth returning to a room after a long winter night. He did not know yet who had left this place behind, or why it had been preserved for him instead of taken by anyone else, but standing inside it, with Milo near the window and the lake shining beyond the glass, Caleb sensed that this cabin had not been waiting to be owned. It had been waiting to be remembered. Caleb remained inside the cabin long after the light outside had shifted from gold to a softer amber, the kind that settles over a lake and makes the whole world feel suspended between memory and evening. He did not rush. There was something respectful in the way he moved, as though raising his voice or his pace would disturb the quiet dignity of the place. Milo had settled near the hearth now, lying on the worn rug with his head up and his ears gently turning toward every small sound the cabin made, from the faint settling of wood to the delicate whisper of wind moving around the eaves. Caleb stood by the window for a while, one hand resting on the back of the chair, watching the sky darken over Northwood Lake as a narrow line of silver began to form across the water. Then he slowly turned his attention to the room again. A narrow shelf near the far wall held more than he had noticed at first. There was an old ceramic dish with a crack through one side, a small brass candle holder darkened by time, and a stack of folded letters tied neatly with a faded blue ribbon that had lost most of its color but not its shape. Caleb approached the shelf with the careful patience of a man stepping into a room where someone important might still be listening. He took the letters down and set them on the table beneath the window, then sat in the old chair opposite them. The chair gave a low, steady creak, not from weakness but from age, like a voice warming up after a long silence. For a moment he did nothing except look at the ribbon. It was the kind of small detail that could have been forgotten by anyone else, yet here it sat with the calm authority of a thing that had waited through years without complaint. When he finally loosened the knot, the first letter slipped free in his hand, and the handwriting on the envelope stopped him before he even opened it. The name was his own. Not just Caleb, but Caleb Mason, written in a careful hand that leaned slightly to the right, as if the writer had taken time with every curve. He felt the quiet pull of recognition before understanding had a chance to catch up. He opened the letter slowly, unfolding the paper until it lay flat against the table. The room seemed to grow even quieter as he read, though the words themselves were not loud in any way. They were intimate, measured, and deeply personal, written by someone who knew how to speak to a man without demanding more from him than he could give. The letter spoke of the cabin, of the years it had stood by the lake, of long seasons spent inside its walls, and of the hope that one day the right person would come back to it. Caleb did not move while he read. His shoulders stayed still, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the page as if every line had been placed there to test whether he would continue or turn away. Milo lifted his head once, watching him with a patient intelligence, then lowered it again when Caleb only exhaled and kept reading. The letter did not ask for anything. It did not explain everything. It simply offered the kind of truth that is gentle enough to be felt before it is understood. There were references to a childhood summer by the lake, to a father who used to mend the porch rail each spring, to evenings when the windows would glow soft yellow and the smell of coffee would drift into the pines. There was also a line that made Caleb pause and look away from the page for a long moment. It said that some places are not left behind because they no longer matter, but because they matter too much to be touched by people who do not know how to hold them with care. He read that line twice. Then a third time. Something in his chest loosened, small and slow, like a knot that had been pulled tight for years and was finally beginning to give. He folded the page carefully and set it beside him, then reached for the second letter. This one was shorter, sealed with a simple hand-drawn symbol at the bottom of the page, and inside was a key taped to the paper with yellowed cloth. The key was old, the metal worn smooth from use, and when Caleb lifted it free, he noticed that the tape had left a faint mark shaped like a cross near the edge of the letter. He turned the key over in his palm, feeling its weight, its coldness, and its strange certainty. It was not much to hold, and yet it felt larger than it looked, like the beginning of an answer that had finally found its way home. Caleb stood and crossed the cabin to the far corner near the back wall, where a narrow cabinet had been built into the wood. He had not noticed its lock before, but now the key fit with a soft, exact turn. The latch released with a small click, and the door opened inward to reveal a shallow compartment lined with faded felt. Inside sat a tin box no bigger than a loaf of bread, dented at one corner but still carefully closed, as though it had been placed there with intention and left untouched for years. Milo rose from the rug and came closer, his nose lifting once toward the box before he sat again, eyes bright with quiet expectation. Caleb held the box in both hands for a moment before setting it on the table. His fingers rested on the lid, and he took one slow breath, listening to the cabin around him. Outside, the lake moved under the last of the daylight, and inside, the old room seemed to lean toward him, waiting for him to decide whether he was ready to know what had been preserved for him all this time. Caleb kept his hand on the lid of the tin box for a long moment, not because he was afraid of what might be inside, but because some part of him understood that once the box opened, the room would not feel exactly the same again. The cabin had grown darker now, though not in a way that felt lonely. The last of the daylight had thinned into a gentle blue wash beyond the window, and the lake outside looked as if it had taken the sky into itself and was holding it quietly. Milo sat upright beside the table, his eyes moving from Caleb to the box and back again, waiting with the calm patience of a companion who knew this was not the kind of moment to interrupt. Caleb drew a slow breath, lifted the lid, and the small sound of metal meeting felt almost ceremonial in the still room. Inside the box lay a folded cloth, a handful of old photographs, and one thin wooden key tag carved with a name that Caleb had not seen in years. He lifted the photographs first. They were soft at the edges, warm with age, and held the kind of ordinary beauty that becomes precious only after time has taken its place around it. There was a picture of a younger man standing on this same porch in summer sunlight, sleeves rolled at the forearms, one hand resting on the rail while the other held a hammer. In another photo, a woman with a gentle smile stood near the lake with her hair lifted by wind, and a small boy, probably no older than 7, grinned beside her with both hands around a bucket of minnows. Caleb stared at that last image for a long moment, his face still, his eyes softening in a way he could not hide even if he wanted to. He set the photographs down carefully and unfolded the cloth. Inside was a pocket watch, its silver casing dulled with time but polished at the edges where fingers had once opened it often. When Caleb pressed the latch, the face sprang open to reveal a simple white dial, black hands, and a tiny crack along the glass that gave it character rather than damage. On the inside lid, engraved in delicate script, were words that made his throat tighten before he even finished reading them. It was not a long sentence, only a few words, but they carried the weight of years. Keep time with what matters most. Caleb closed the watch gently and sat back in the chair, letting the meaning settle in slowly. The cabin was so quiet that he could hear the faint ticking from the old clock above the stove, each second measured in steady, as if the house itself had chosen this exact moment to remind him that time was never only about loss. It was also about what remained. Milo rose from the rug and came to stand beside Caleb's knee, his head lifting in a small gesture of comfort. Caleb rested a hand on the dog's neck and looked back toward the photographs, then the box, then the little key tag. The name on it was his father's. For a breathless moment, the room seemed to shift around that fact. Not dramatically, not in any way that could be called loud, but with the subtle force of truth finding its place. Caleb remembered a summer far back in his life, when he was still small enough to stand on a chair and reach the windowsill, watching his father work at a cabin near the water with sleeves rolled and shoulders bent into the job. He remembered the smell of sawdust, lake wind, and coffee from a dented thermos. He remembered the way his father had always paused at the end of the day to look out over the lake, as if measuring something invisible in the light. Those memories had never left him completely, but they had been packed away so long and so carefully that he had almost mistaken them for dreams. He picked up the letter again and read the next line with a slower heart. It explained that the cabin had belonged to the family, then been protected in silence after certain years took people in different directions. It did not ask for forgiveness. It did not attempt to rewrite pain. It only offered a truth shaped by care. Some inheritances are not about money or title, but about being trusted with what love could not bear to lose. Caleb let out a breath he did not know he had been holding. Outside, the first hint of evening mist began to rise from the lake, drifting low across the water like a soft veil. The window glass caught the reflection of the room behind him, and for a moment Caleb saw himself there, seated in the old chair with the box open before him, a veteran who had spent too many years believing that being left behind meant he had no place to belong. Yet the cabin did not feel empty now. It felt prepared. It felt intentional. It felt like a hand extended across time. He stood and walked to the window with the pocket watch in one palm and the photographs in the other. The sky over Northwood Lake had shifted into a deep indigo, and the first stars were beginning to appear, small and patient above the tree line. Milo came to stand beside him, both of them facing the same quiet horizon. Caleb looked down at the watch one more time, then out toward the water, and something in his expression changed, not into happiness exactly, but into the first real shape of peace. The cabin had not simply waited for him to arrive. It had waited to tell him that he was still part of a story worth keeping. The night settled over Northwood Lake with a quietness so complete that even the cabin seemed to breathe more slowly, as if it understood the importance of letting the past speak without interruption. Caleb stood at the window for a long time after reading the last line, the pocket watch resting in one hand, the photographs in the other, his reflection faint in the dark glass. Outside, the water held the last traces of silver light, and beyond it the trees stood in a deep blue silhouette, still and watchful under the rising mist. Milo remained close, his body angled toward Caleb with the calm loyalty of a shadow that had chosen to stay warm. At some point Caleb returned the photographs to the box and set the watch gently beside them, then lowered himself into the chair again, not because he was tired, but because the room had begun to feel like a place where standing too long might break the fragile spell of the moment. He rested his forearms on the table and let his eyes move slowly across the cabin one more time. The old lamp, the cracked ceramic dish, the folded letters, the worn floorboards, the faint outline of boots by the hearth, all of it now felt less like evidence of absence and more like proof of a life carefully preserved. There was a kind of tenderness in that realization that Caleb did not have words for yet. It simply settled in him, quiet and steady, like heat from a fire reaching the far corners of a cold room. Sometime later he reached for the pocket watch again and opened it to the light from the window. The crack in the glass caught a faint reflection from the lake, and the hands inside seemed almost suspended between 1 minute and the next. Caleb turned it over in his palm, studying the engraving until the sentence became more than a message and began to feel like a command to live differently. Keep time with what matters most. He thought about all the years he had spent marking time by appointments, by duty, by the shape of loss, by the long roads between one obligation and the next. He thought about how often veteran stories were told in numbers, in ranks, in dates, and in places that had nothing to do with home. Yet what he held now was not measured that way. It was measured in memory, in care, in the small patient work of someone who had remembered him enough to leave this behind. Milo shifted on the rug and let out a quiet sigh, the kind of sound a dog makes when the room finally feels safe enough to sleep in. Caleb looked down at him and gave the faintest smile, one of those rare expressions that arrive slowly on a face more practiced in holding things and then letting them out. He reached beneath the table and rested his hand on the dog's neck, feeling the steady warmth there, the quiet pulse of life that asked for nothing but presence. Then he stood, took the photographs from the table, and carried them to the small shelf by the window. One by one he arranged them there in a line, not as relics, but as a way of making the room feel inhabited by kindness instead of silence. The summer lake image went nearest the lamp. The portrait of the young woman with the wind in her hair stood beside it. The picture of the boy with the fishing bucket was last, and Caleb paused over that one longer than the others. Something in the child's open smile reminded him of a time before everything had become heavier, before years of distance had made even family memories feel like objects stored in another person's life. When he finished, the shelf looked different. Not decorated, not curated, but alive in a subtle and human way. He opened the cabin door just enough to let the cool night air slip inside. The smell of water and pine drifted through the room, clean and faintly sweet, and somewhere beyond the porch a loon called across the lake, its cry thin and lonely and beautiful in the dark. Caleb stood in the doorway for several breaths, taking in the stillness, then stepped out onto the porch with Milo beside him. The boards underfoot gave that same soft creak from earlier, but now the sound felt welcoming, as if the cabin had recognized the weight of his return. He looked across the water and saw the moon beginning to rise, a pale bright coin lifting above the trees and laying a narrow path of light across the surface of the lake. The sight held him in place. Not because it was grand, but because it was gentle. In that moment Caleb understood that the cabin had not called him here to prove anything. It had called him here to remember that being chosen does not always look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like being trusted with a memory, with a key, with a room that still remembers how to hold warmth. He remained there beside the railing until the cold touched the tips of his fingers, and Milo pressed quietly against his leg, both of them looking out over the water as the lake shimmered beneath the moon and the forgotten cabin behind them glowed with the kind of peace that only comes when a heart finally begins to recognize where it belongs. Morning arrived over Northwood Lake with a pale, silver light that drifted through the trees and touched the cabin as gently as fingertips on an old photograph. Caleb had not slept deeply, but he had rested in the way a tired heart sometimes rests when it finally stops resisting the truth. The moon had gone down hours earlier, and in its place the first quiet warmth of dawn now moved across the porch, the water, and the weathered boards beneath his boots. He stood outside with a cup of coffee held in both hands, breathing in the cold air as Milo circled once near the steps and then settled beside him, alert but calm, his ears shifting with every soft sound rising from the lake. The cabin looked different in the morning. What had felt hushed and almost sacred the night before now carried the ordinary tenderness of a place that had survived long enough to be useful again. The faded wood glowed softly where the sun touched it, the window glass held a thin reflection of the trees, and even the porch rail, with all its age and wear, seemed less like a remnant than a witness. Caleb took a slow sip and looked toward the water. A light mist rested low over the lake, moving in thin ribbons between the shoreline and the pines. Somewhere beyond the trees, a loon called once, and then the silence returned, full and complete. He thought again about the letters, the photographs, the watch, and the old truth that had started to take shape inside him. This was not a forgotten place after all. It had only been waiting for someone who could recognize the difference between emptiness and preservation. He stepped back inside after a while, letting the warmth from the room meet the cold still on his coat. Milo followed him in and went straight to the hearth, where he lay down with his head on his paws, though his eyes remained open. Caleb set the coffee on the table and moved slowly through the cabin, more curious now than cautious. There was no urgency in him, only the steady patience of a man learning how to belong to a room that had already begun to welcome him. He noticed things he had missed the night before, small details that seemed to have emerged with the morning light, a faint seam in the wall beside the bookcase, a narrow strip of brass at the base of the cabinet, a soft draft curling near the stove that should not have existed in such a tightly built space. He paused there, one hand resting lightly on the back of the chair, listening. The cabin was still, but not empty. It had the quiet of a place holding one last secret with a kind of reverence. Caleb moved to the wall and traced the seam with his fingertips. The line was nearly invisible unless the light hit it a certain way, and when he pressed gently, he felt the faint give of old wood shaped by patient hands. He glanced back at Milo, who had lifted his head at once and was watching him with unmistakable interest. "What do you think, boy?" Caleb murmured. Milo stood and came over, nose pointed toward the baseboard, then nudged the wood once with determined focus. Caleb gave a faint breath through his nose, almost a laugh, and reached down to test the panel again. This time a latch gave way with a soft click. The section of wall opened inward just enough to reveal a narrow hidden space, shallow but carefully built, lined with the same aged cedar as the rest of the cabin. Inside sat a small tin folder, a worn leather notebook, and a bundle of envelopes tied together with a frayed piece of twine. Caleb stood very still. The air around him seemed to shift, not with fear, but with the solemn charge of discovery. He pulled the notebook out first. The cover was darkened by time, the corners rounded smooth from use, and on the front someone had written his father's name in the same steady hand he had seen in the letters. He sat down slowly at the table and opened it. The pages inside were filled with neat handwritten notes, repair sketches, weather observations, dates, and short lines that read less like instructions and more like memory preserved in plain language. There were entries about the lake freezing too early one winter, about the porch boards needing to be replaced by spring, about the sound the pines made during storms, about coffee by the window on mornings when the light looked best across the water. Caleb read line after line with his hand resting against the paper as if he needed the touch to stay grounded. This was not a ledger. It was a life. A quiet, practical, loving account of years spent caring for a place that had clearly been treasured by someone who knew how to hold on without making a performance of it. The envelopes contained letters from different seasons, some addressed to Caleb, some never sent, and one that seemed to have been written but left closed for a long time. He did not open that one yet. Instead, he sat back and let the notebook settle in his lap while the morning brightened around him. The room filled with a warmer gold as the sun climbed higher, catching the dust in the air and turning it into something almost luminous. Milo returned to his place by the hearth, though his gaze never left Caleb. There was a tenderness in that simple companionship that made the cabin feel less like a mystery solved and more like a family memory being gently restored. Caleb looked once more at the hidden compartment, then at the pages in his hands, and felt the deepest ache of all begin to loosen. What had been left behind was not abandonment. It was care. It was intention. It was a way of saying that even after silence, even after distance, a man could still be remembered enough to come home to something real. By late morning, the cabin had begun to feel less like a place Caleb had entered by chance and more like a room that had quietly opened its arms after a very long wait. The sunlight had risen higher over Northwood Lake now, sliding across the water in bright silver fragments and spilling through the windows in warm, angled bands that touched the table, the shelves, and the old floorboards with the kind of softness that makes a house seem almost alive. Caleb sat at the table with the notebook open in front of him, one hand resting lightly on the page as he read and reread the handwriting that had once belonged to his father. Milo lay near the hearth, head lifted, following Caleb with calm eyes that seemed to understand the gravity of the morning even if he could not name it. The notebook had already shown him so much, but with each page the cabin grew more intimate, less like a mystery and more like a conversation that had been waiting for the right moment to continue. Caleb turned another page and found notes about repairs along the porch, the way the west wind hit the cabin in autumn, and a careful list of supplies for the next season: nails, lamp oil, coffee, flour, batteries, wood sealant, and one line underlined twice that read, "Keep the lantern by the window where the lake can see it." He paused there. Something in that simple sentence settled deeply in him. It was practical, yes, but it was also tender, almost protective, as if the cabin itself had been meant to signal that someone was expected, someone worth waiting for. Caleb leaned back in the chair and let the thought breathe. Veteran stories were often told as if they began with hardship and ended with endurance, but there was another thread running through this one, quieter and harder to see at first, the thread of being remembered by people who understood how silence can become a language. He looked toward the hidden compartment in the wall and then back to the notebook. The next section of pages was dated in a different year, and the writing had grown slightly slower, the letters a little more deliberate, as if the hand behind them knew time was becoming precious. There were entries about winters when the lake froze in a clean white sheet, about summers when the porch stayed open all night, about a small dog that had belonged to the family years ago and slept near the fireplace because he hated thunderstorms. Caleb smiled at that, faintly and without even realizing it, because he could suddenly imagine the rhythms of this place not as abandoned space, but as a lived-in memory made from mornings, meals, repairs, and weather. He kept turning the pages until a folded sheet slipped out and landed softly in his lap. It had been tucked behind the cover with care, and when he opened it, he saw immediately that it was not a note for someone else to read casually. It was a letter. The top line carried his father's name, and below it the words were written in the same steady, plain hand, but the tone was more personal than the notebook, more direct, as though the writer had finally reached the point where he no longer wanted to explain the cabin, only the heart behind it. Caleb read in silence while the room seemed to hold still around him. The letter spoke of long years, of decisions made to protect what could not be explained easily to younger eyes, of an old promise to keep the lake cabin safe until the time came for it to be passed forward with love instead of paperwork. There was no bitterness in the letter, no attempt to justify the past. Instead, there was gratitude, memory, and a restrained kind of hope. His father wrote about learning that some inheritances are not received in a clean, simple moment, but only after a man has walked enough roads to understand what home is supposed to mean. Caleb lowered the page and stared at the sunlit table for a long time. He had spent too many years believing that distance meant disconnection, that silence meant dismissal, that being left outside the center of a family story meant the story had moved on without him. Yet here in this cabin, in the middle of a quiet morning by the lake, every detail seemed to say the opposite. The notebook, the letters, the old photographs, the watch, the hidden space in the wall, they had all been preserved not to hide him from the truth, but to deliver it gently enough that he could actually receive it. Milo rose then, padded to Caleb's side, and placed his chin against Caleb's knee with the soft certainty of a creature who knew when sorrow had started to soften. Caleb reached down and rested his hand between the dog's ears, feeling the steady warmth there. He looked at the open letter again, and this time he saw a sentence near the bottom that had almost escaped him. It said that the lake cabin had never belonged to the family because of value alone. It had belonged because it was the one place where love had been practiced quietly, without applause, and that kind of love should never disappear without leaving a door open. Caleb blinked slowly and sat with that for a while. Outside, the light had shifted again, brighter now, and the lake shimmered beyond the window as if the water itself were listening. The cabin no longer felt like a borrowed room or a forgotten address. It felt like a witness. It felt like the last page of a family story written not in grand gestures, but in steady acts of care. Caleb folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the table, then looked around the room with a new kind of tenderness in his face. This place had not simply been hiding a secret. It had been holding a blessing, waiting for the right heart to understand it. By the time the afternoon began to lean toward evening, the cabin had taken on a soft golden quiet that made every surface look gently touched by memory. Sunlight came through the windows in long narrow bars, crossing the table, the notebook, the photographs, and Caleb himself as he sat in the same chair he had claimed that morning, though now the room no longer felt like a place he had stumbled into. It felt lived in, recognized, and strangely near to sacred. Milo had remained close through the day, moving from the hearth to the door and back again with the steady, watchful patience of a companion who understood that some hours ask for silence more than comfort. Caleb had spent the past hour reading the notebook one last time, then laying the letters back in their order with careful hands, as if each page were a fragile part of the same small miracle. He rested his palm on the table and looked out toward the lake, where the water had changed from silver to a deep, glassy blue, and the pines along the shoreline stood tall and dark against the lowering light. There was a feeling in him now that had not been there when he first arrived, a feeling not of being rescued, but of being received. It came slowly, like warmth returning to fingers after a long winter, and it carried with it the heavy, sweet realization that the cabin had not only belonged to his family. It had belonged to the part of him that had spent years searching for a place where grief could settle without being ashamed of itself. He rose from the chair and walked to the window, the pocket watch in his coat pocket and the folded letter in his hand. He opened the watch once more and watched the hands move with their quiet confidence, each second falling exactly where it should. Caleb thought about all the roads behind him, the years measured in duty, in distance, in the hard discipline of keeping moving when something inside him had wanted to stop. He thought about how veteran stories are often told through loss and endurance, but what he held now was not only endurance. It was continuity. It was a family line reaching forward through time, not to demand anything from him, but to give him back the shape of belonging. Milo came up beside him and sat at the window, looking out at the lake with ears forward and body still, as if he too had become part of the cabin's quiet witness. Caleb lowered the watch and looked down at the dog. There was a kind of companionship in that glance that did not need language. It lived in the shared hush, in the way both of them stood together facing the same water, as if waiting for the final piece of a truth to rise into view. Then Caleb turned back to the table and opened the last envelope. Inside was a shorter note, handwritten in the same steady script, and the first line was enough to make him pause before the rest of the page even reached his eyes. It spoke of trust. Not the sort granted casually, but the kind shaped by years, by weather, by sacrifice, by the knowledge that a place is only truly safe when it is given to someone who will not confuse ownership with care. The note said the cabin was meant to be lived in again, not sealed away. It said the lake had outlasted every season because it knew how to wait. It said that some homes do not become homes when they are built, but when someone returns with enough humility to listen to what they have been trying to say. Caleb sat back slowly, the page resting in his lap, and let the words settle through him. Outside, the first shadow of evening moved across the porch rail, and the reflection of the room and the darkening window looked softer now, less like a stranger and more like a memory taking shape. He looked at the old photographs on the shelf, at the watch in his hand, at the notebook full of repairs and weather and ordinary care, and then at Milo, who had finally laid his head down but kept one eye open, still guarding him with quiet devotion. Caleb understood then that the real inheritance was not the cabin itself, not the furniture, not the lake view, not even the watch. It was the proof that love had been here long before he arrived, and that it had been patient enough to leave a path open for him to follow. He stood once more, folded the note, and placed it beside the watch. The cabin seemed to breathe around him, not with mystery now, but with peace. He could hear the lake outside, the faint movement of water against the shore, the soft creak of wood settling for the evening, the whisper of trees in the distance. And in that gentle soundscape, Caleb felt the final hard knot inside him loosen at last, not all at once, but enough to know that something had changed for good. The room that had waited through all those years was no longer waiting alone. It had finally been answered. The last light of evening had already begun to fade from the windows when Caleb sat for a while in complete stillness, listening to the cabin settle around him as if it had finally recognized the weight of his presence and decided not to keep any more of its breath held back. Outside, Northwood Lake darkened into a soft sheet of indigo, the shoreline disappearing into the trees while the porch creaked faintly with the cool of the night. Inside, the lamp by the window cast a warm circle of light across the table, the notebook, the pocket watch, and the folded letters, and that small pool of gold made the room feel less like a forgotten place and more like a home that had quietly learned to trust him. Milo lifted his head once from the rug, looked toward Caleb, then rested his chin back down with the easy certainty of a companion who had already accepted what the heart was only beginning to understand. Caleb reached for the watch again, turned it over in his palm, and then slipped it into the pocket of his shirt with a careful motion that felt almost ceremonial. He stood, crossed the room, and set the last note back beside the notebook, not because he was finished with it, but because the words no longer needed to be held in his hands to be true. Then, one by one, he went around the cabin and touched the spaces that had carried the story, the shelf by the window, the chair by the hearth, the wooden frame around the hidden compartment, the porch door with its old brass latch, the corner where the lantern had once been kept. Each detail seemed to answer him in its own quiet way, as if the room itself had been waiting for this slow and reverent kind of attention all along. By the time the night deepened, Caleb lit the lantern in the window exactly where the notebook had said it should be. Its glow pushed softly through the glass and out over the dark water, a steady signal in the cold, the kind of light that does not demand to be seen yet still reaches far. He paused there for a long time, looking out at the lake while the cabin behind him held its warmth. The surface of the water reflected the moon in a long narrow trail, and the pines along the shore stood like quiet sentinels under the stars. In that moment he understood something he had never been able to say in any lawyer's office, on any road, or in any room where his name was folded into paperwork and distance. Belonging was not always loud. It did not always arrive with a dramatic revelation or a perfect answer. Sometimes it arrived like this, through a place that remembered your family before you did, through a dog that never stopped standing beside you, through a letter that made the years seem less like loss and more like a path that had finally led somewhere gentle. The next morning came with a pale, silver dawn and the faint sound of water moving against the shore. Caleb woke before the sun climbed fully over the trees, pulled on his jacket, and stepped outside with Milo at his side. The air had that clean, early chill that wakes the skin before the mind is fully ready, and the porch boards were damp with dew. He stood there with both hands on the railing and looked out over the lake while Milo wandered a few steps ahead, nose low, tail relaxed, exploring the morning as if he too knew this place had changed. Caleb made his way down to the edge of the water and knelt beside a flat stone half buried in the sand. The surface was cool and smooth under his fingers. He turned it over once, then set it back down and smiled faintly, a private expression touched by peace. No one was watching him except the trees, the water, and the dog who had followed him through every hard mile and every quiet pause. He thought about all the veteran stories people told and how often they focused on the visible scars, the hard roads, the years of survival. But this one, he realized, was about something older and softer than survival. It was about being remembered. It was about being handed back a place where the past did not have to be erased in order for the future to begin. It was about a cabin by a lake, a family that had spoken through handwriting and careful repairs, and a man who had come expecting an ending only to find a beginning waiting in the morning light. Caleb stood, brushed the sand from his hands, and looked once more toward the cabin. The windows glowed faintly behind him, and the lantern in the front window still shone with its patient flame. Milo pressed gently against his leg, and Caleb rested his hand on the dog's head, feeling the warmth there, the steadiness, the faithful calm. Then he turned and walked back toward the porch, not as a visitor this time, but as someone returning to a place that had finally made room for him. Behind him, the lake shimmered in the first full light of day, and ahead of him the cabin waited with open silence, ready to be lived in, ready to be loved, ready to become a home at last.